All right, so let's dive into some pretty familiar territory for you, right? The whole logic and ontology thing.
Hmm.
But even if you've been doing philosophy for years, I think this deep dive might surprise you. We're going straight to the source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and really trying to uncover those like little intersections and points of debate that even a seasoned philosopher might not have considered.
You know, it's funny because even just starting with logic, that word, it's like we're already stepping into a philosophical minefield. It's not just one thing.
No, definitely not. I mean,
Right.
it's easy to say logic, like we all know what we're talking about, but the Stanford Encyclopedia entry lays out four different conceptions, and they don't always agree,
Right. You've got that, L1, the formal languages, all those abstract systems, the symbols you find in math or logic. It's all about pure structure.
like a philosophical code almost.
Yeah.
And then there's L2 logic as those formally valid inferences. So here, it's the architecture of the argument itself, how that shape guarantees the conclusion, almost regardless of what you're actually talking about.
And then we move to L3, the exploration of logical truths. So these are the statements that are true no matter what content you put in them, like those fundamental building blocks of thinking, right?
Okay, so we've got the structure of languages, the validity of arguments, and these universal truths. But then there's L4, which gets more Kantian. Logic as the study of the form of judgments.
Yeah, here logic gets almost, I don't know, psychological. We're examining the structure of how we think and categorize the world.
So, four very different ways to think about logic. And I bet you can already see how this leads to some pretty huge philosophical debates. Like, how do we even decide which expressions are those logical constants, those terms that are kind of at the foundation of our logical systems?
Ooh, yeah, that question has been bugging logicians forever. One way is to look at those proof theoretic properties. So can you define those constants through the rules of a system? But then there's the semantic approach, asking if those constants hold true even if you swap out what they refer to.
So, the way we define those constants completely changes how we analyze arguments, maybe even what we consider logical at all. As a philosopher, I bet you've run into that a lot, right?
Absolutely. And that's just with logic, right? We haven't even gotten to ontology. Everyone uses the word, but they think it just means what exists. But as you know, it's so much more interesting than that. The Stanford Encyclopedia breaks it down into four facets, and I think this will resonate with you.
Yeah, definitely. It's so easy to get caught up in just listing the stuff of reality,
Hmm.
but ontology is way more than just an inventory, isn't it?
Exactly. So you start with O1, which is ontological commitment. What do our beliefs, our theories, even our language, what do they commit us to accepting as existing, whether we even realize it or not?
So interesting. It's like ontology isn't just about what's out there objectively. It's about the implications of our own thinking.
Yes. And then, of course, you have the more familiar one, O2, the study of what exists. But even that raises the question, is that really the core of what ontology is about?
It does make you wonder, even if we could list everything, would that really be the point?
And that brings us to O3, exploring the most general features of existing things. So their relationships, categories, those underlying structures that kind of govern how they all hang together. Now, ontology is getting really metaphysical.
And that's where it probably gets most interesting for a philosopher like you, right? It's not that things exist, but how they exist, in what kind of web of relationships.
Absolutely. And then finally, we pull way back, O4, meta-ontology. Here, ontology turns inward, questioning its own methods, its assumptions. Like, what are we even trying to do with ontology, and can we even answer its questions in the first place?
Some meta, right? It's like saying, hold on, before we ask what exists, we need to ask, what does it even mean to ask that?
And here's the thing. These four aspects of ontology are all tangled up. Thinking about meta-ontology makes you question if just listing what exists is even the right approach. And once you understand those ontological commitments we have, it might make us rethink our answers about what's actually out there and how we categorize it.
Wow. It's like this whole interconnected web of ideas. So we've got four conceptions of logic, four facets of ontology. I'm already seeing where they might clash and create some really interesting philosophical sparks.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets exciting, and this is where your philosophical mind is going to come in handy. One key intersection is between those formal languages, the L1, and ontological commitment, that O1. Think about it. Formal languages, with all their rigorous structure, can actually help us figure out those hidden ontological commitments we're making in our everyday beliefs and theories. It's like using a logical microscope to see what's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah. Like an x-ray of our own mind, showing us the ontological skeletons we're carrying around. And this is where Quine enters the picture, right? He said that looking at the quantifiers in our best scientific theories, That tells us what has to exist.
Exactly. For Quine, those quantifiers in science, they weren't just a linguistic quirk. They were telling us something deep about what reality is made of. If our best theories need certain things to exist for them to be true, well, then those things are ontologically committed to.
But, as a philosopher, I've got to push back a bit, right? What if scientific language isn't a perfect mirror of reality? Maybe those quantifiers aren't about what actually exists, but just how we happen to be thinking about the world.
That's a great point. And that's where other views of quantifiers come in, like substitutional semantics. Instead of seeing quantifiers as ranging over this fixed set of objects, substitutional semantics focuses on what terms you can plug into certain spots in a sentence. It gives you a more, I don't know, a less straightforward, less realist picture of how language relates to ontology.
So maybe Quine's idea of ontological commitment was a little too simple. The way we use language might not perfectly map onto what actually exists.
It's a debate that's far from over, and it really highlights how complex these philosophical questions get when you try to connect logic and ontology. And speaking of deep questions, another fascinating overlap is the question of logic's neutrality. Those logical truths, the L3 ones, do they, in and of themselves, force us to accept that certain things exist? Or can logic operate completely independently of any ontological commitments?
That's a good one. It's almost like asking if you can have logic without a world to be logical about.
Exactly. This ties into that whole debate over the empty domain in logic. Can you have logical truths if absolutely nothing exists? It's kind of a mind-blowing thought experiment.
And I bet you, as a philosopher, have thought about that one quite a bit. It really challenges our whole idea of what logic even is and what it can do.
For sure. Some logicians say that logical systems can work perfectly fine even without a populated domain. And that's led to things like free logics, where terms don't have to actually refer to anything for those logical inferences to still be valid.
So maybe logic doesn't need a pre-existing world to work its magic. Maybe it can kind of create its own world through those formal rules. But then where does that leave us with ontology?
$1 million question, right? And this is where we're getting right to the heart of how logic and ontology are related. You've got logic on the one hand, with its power to create systems, make valid inferences, and then ontology trying to grasp the fundamental nature of existence itself. Are they really two sides of the same coin, or are they always going to be at odds?
This is getting so meta. I love it. But before we float off into the metaphysical ether completely, let's bring in another big name, Frege. He had that famous argument for logicism, the idea that arithmetic is really just logic in disguise.
Ah, Frege, always pushing the boundaries. That logicism argument was a bold move, trying to ground math in the bedrock of logic. And it has some pretty wild ontological implications. If arithmetic is just logic, then numbers themselves kind of become logical objects, right?
So by connecting logic and math, he's also making a statement about what exists, at least in that world of abstract objects. But I'm sure not everyone was happy with that kind of ontological expansion.
You got it. Logicism is still hotly debated. Some see it as brilliant, others see it as ontological trickery. It all comes down to how comfortable you are with logic itself, creating a whole world of these abstract things.
And speaking of pushing philosophical buttons, we've got to mention Carnap, right? His radical idea that traditional ontology is just a meaningless game. He basically said that questions like, are there numbers, are either totally obvious or totally nonsensical, depending on the framework you're using.
Carnap really throws a wrench in the works, doesn't he? His argument was that so many of the questions we ask in ontology, they're not real problems. They just come from getting confused about language. He made this big distinction between internal and external questions.
Right. Internal questions being those asked within a specific framework, and external ones being about the framework itself. As a philosopher, I'm sure you see how meta this is getting.
Oh, absolutely. For Carnap, asking, are there numbers inside a system that already has numbers? It's like asking, are there bachelors who are unmarried? It's true by definition, but it doesn't tell us anything about the world.
But asking that same question from outside any framework, for Carnap, well, that's just meaningless. It's like we're trapped in this linguistic maze we've built for ourselves.
Exactly. Of course, this led to a huge debate with Quine, who completely rejected that sharp line between analytic and synthetic truths that Carnap was relying on.
Right, because if you can't cleanly separate those truths that are true by definition from those that tell us about the world, Carnap's whole internal-external thing kind of falls apart.
You got it. But even Quine, as much as he disagreed with Carnap, he also thought traditional ontology was a dead end. He thought we shouldn't get caught up in these abstract questions about what exists in some ultimate sense. Instead, we should focus on the ontological commitments of our best scientific theories.
So both Carnap and Quine, from totally different angles, they were both pushing for a more, I don't know, grounded approach to ontology. Kind of remarkable, actually.
It is. And what's even more interesting is how Carnap's ideas are having a resurgence lately. Philosophers are finding new ways to use that internal-external distinction, what it means for ontology. But we've covered a lot already. I think it's time for a break. We'll be back to explore even more mind-bending stuff in part two.
So we were just talking about how both Carnap and Quine, even though they came at it from different angles, they both thought we needed to move away from that traditional way of doing ontology. But it's interesting, right? The question of what exists in some form, it just keeps coming back. Philosophers can't seem to resist it.
I know, it's such a fundamental question. How can you not ask it? But I've noticed lately, even the way people are asking that question, it's changing. It's less about just listing everything and more about what's real, what's at the foundation of it all, the very nature of reality. It's like ontology went through its own existential crisis and came out with a whole new set of questions. I think you're right. And this shift has led some philosophers back to those formal languages, but not in the way Carnap might have expected. They're not trying to dissolve ontological questions, but to use formal languages to describe reality as it is, without all our usual human baggage, those everyday concepts.
So like building a fundamental language of reality, that's a pretty ambitious goal. It makes me think of physicists searching for a theory of everything.
That's a good comparison. The idea is that our ordinary language, it's too messy. All those categories, those blurry lines, it just can't handle describing reality at the deepest level. We need a language that can cut through all that and show us the real structure underneath.
Okay, but here's where I get stuck. If this fundamental language is so different from how we usually think, how can we even understand what it's saying? It'd be like trying to read a book in a language you've never seen before. You might recognize the letters, but the meaning would be totally lost.
You've hit on the main challenge, and this leads to some pretty wild ideas like objectless ontologies or using logics without any variables. These are systems that try to describe reality without those familiar categories of objects and properties.
I'm trying to picture a description of reality without objects. It's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen.
Right. It's a tough one for our minds because we're so used to thinking in terms of things. But these philosophers are saying, what if, at the most basic level, reality isn't like that at all? What if we need totally new ways of thinking to even begin to get it?
As a philosopher, that's both really exciting and really hard to wrap my head around. It's cool to think that logic might be the key to unlocking those deep secrets of reality, but it's also humbling to realize how limited our current understanding might be.
That tension between being excited and being humbled, that's at the core of what philosophy is, right? But let's switch gears a bit. We've been talking about the structure of language, the structure of reality. What about the structure of thought itself? Is it just a coincidence that the way we think seems to map so well onto how the world is put together?
Now, that's a question. It is kind of spooky when you stop and think about it. Logic gives us these precise tools for reasoning, making inferences, and then the world itself seems to follow certain rules, basic principles. Is it just luck that those two things line up?
It's tempting to think there's got to be some deeper connection, right? But what is it? Does our mind somehow create the structure of reality? Or does reality shape our minds? Or is there some even deeper cause, something that explains both?
Let's play with this for a second. Are we in some kind of mind-bending matrix where our thoughts literally create reality? I have to admit, that's a fun thought for a philosopher who spent way too much time thinking about what's real.
I can see the appeal. But there's also the more down-to-earth explanation evolution, right? Maybe reality structure has been shaping our minds for millions of years, selecting for those ways of thinking that helped us survive.
Survival of the fittest thoughts, huh? It kind of makes sense. If our ancestors couldn't figure out the world around them, they probably wouldn't last long. But still, it feels like a jump to say that evolution explains why our thoughts and the structure of reality match up so well.
It's a big jump, definitely. And then, of course, we have that Kantian possibility, that our minds aren't just passively reflecting reality, they're actively shaping it. Kant said that we experience the world through these built-in categories of understanding, like space, time, causality.
Good old Kant, always shaking things up.
Yeah.
So in his view, the structure we see in the world isn't necessarily in the world itself. It's something our minds are adding. That's a pretty radical idea.
Totally radical, and it raises all sorts of questions about mind and reality. But even if we say, okay, there is a match between thought and reality, not everyone agrees that reality has that kind of structure we think it does.
Right, like nominalism. Nominalists say there aren't those neat categories, those abstract things out there in the world, even though our language and thought seem to be all about them.
Yeah, nominalism is a constant challenge to any ontology that depends on those abstract objects. For nominalists, those things are just useful fictions, helpful ways of organizing our thoughts, but not ultimately real. And that brings us right back to that dance between logic and ontology. The tools we use for analyzing language, the frameworks we build for understanding reality, even the categories we think with, it's all tangled up in this big philosophical web.
It's enough to make your head spin. But that's what's so cool about it. We're uncovering these hidden connections, these unexpected clashes, these deep questions, all at the heart of how we understand logic and ontology. And this isn't just abstract stuff. It affects how we see everything, from science to ethics to even the meaning of life.
Exactly. Logic and ontology aren't just some intellectual game. They're a way of understanding ourselves and our place in the universe. By looking at how we think, what assumptions we're making about reality, we can understand ourselves and the world around us in a much deeper way.
I love that. And I think this is a good spot to pause and take it all in. When we come back for part 3, we'll explore even more mind-blowing possibilities and leave you with one final question to ponder. Stick with us. All right, welcome back. As we wrap up our deep dives into logic and ontology, I keep thinking about all the limitations of our understanding. Like, we can build these systems of thought, analyze language, try to figure out the structure of reality, but are we just chasing after something we can never really grasp?
That's a classic philosophical problem, isn't it? We create formal languages, we debate about truth, we search for that fundamental language that will show us reality as it really is. But what if there are just some things that are beyond human comprehension? What if there are truths, structures, ways of being that we just can't get our minds around?
That's exactly what I'm wondering. We're trying so hard to make sense of it all. But what if we're fundamentally limited? What if there are things out there that are just too complex, too profound for us to ever fully understand?
It's a pretty dizzying thought, and it makes you wonder, if we could design that perfect language, the one free from all our human biases and limitations, would we even want to know what it told us about reality?
You know, as a philosopher, I've spent so much time thinking about these big questions. What exists? What can we know? What's the meaning of it all? But sometimes I wonder if there are some mysteries that are better left alone. Like maybe some truths are just too much for us to handle. Too profound, too disturbing. They might completely overturn everything we think we know.
It's a thought-provoking idea, isn't it? Imagine a language that could cut through all our illusions and show us the ultimate truth of the universe. Would that be liberating, or would it completely shatter our world?
Maybe it would be like staring into the sun. You might get a glimpse of something incredible, but it could also blind you, you know? Maybe we need those limitations, those filters, to appreciate the world as we experience it.
That's a great analogy. It reminds us that the search for knowledge isn't just about collecting facts or building theories. It's also about understanding ourselves, our place in this whole vast system of existence.
And maybe part of that understanding is realizing that there are limits to what we can know.
Yeah,
And maybe accepting those limits can be just as enriching as trying to push past them.
maybe the real challenge in philosophy isn't about finding all the answers, but learning to live with the questions, to appreciate the wonder and mystery that's all around us.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. We've explored this amazing interplay between logic and ontology. We've wrestled with huge questions about language, truth, reality, and we've even wondered if some mysteries are better left unsolved.
It's been a real philosophical adventure, and I hope this has inspired you to keep thinking about these ideas, to question your own assumptions, and to keep that philosophical spark alive.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into logic and ontology. If you want to explore even further, definitely check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the topic. It's a goldmine of insights, and it really shows the power of philosophical inquiry.
And as you continue your own philosophical journey, don't be afraid to embrace the questions, to be amazed by the mystery, and to find that joy in trying to understand it all.
Keep asking, keep exploring, and keep those philosophical fires burning.